Hey there everybody, my name is Mr. Young and welcome back to another awesome art class. I hope you all had a fantastic first week of school and I got to meet so many of you last week, and a thank you for everyone who turned in their self-portraits with the masks. So we're going to today do something a little bit different. We're going to explore graffiti art. And specifically, we're going to talk about the history of graffiti and then learn about famous graffiti artists. After that, we're going to create our own artworks based on the graffiti designs that we learned about. First, what is graffiti? Well, graffiti is also known as street art, and there are writings or drawings made on walls and surfaces, and it's usually done without the permission from others. Because of this, it is often illegal, and it's considered vandalism if you do mark in public spaces without permission. But because graffiti artists have become so popular, many times graffiti artists are actually paid, and they are asked to create their graffiti art in those public areas. Graffiti art also ranges from simple written words to elaborate wall paintings, and it's existed for many years from ancient times, dating back to ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and the Roman Empire, where people would write on walls. The graffiti that we see today throughout the city is called modern graffiti, and that's when they typically use spray paint or outdoor paints to create their artworks or murals, and that began back in the 1960s in Philadelphia. And later on in the 1970s, graffiti culture shifted to New York, where it became really popular. So let's watch this short video now, which talks about the history of graffiti.
Subway cars, tagged bridges, mural-covered walls. Graffiti pops up boldly throughout our cities. It can make statements about identity, art, empowerment, and politics, while simultaneously being associated with destruction. And, it turns out, it's nothing new. Graffiti, or the act of writing or scribbling on public property, has been around for thousands of years. And across that span of time, it's raised the same questions we debate now. Is it art? Is it vandalism? In the 1st century BCE, Romans regularly inscribed messages on public walls, while oceans away, Mayans were prolifically scratching drawings onto their surfaces. And it wasn't always a subversive act. In Pompeii, ordinary citizens regularly marked public walls with magic spells, prose about unrequited love, political campaign slogans, and even messages to champion their favorite gladiators. Some, including the Greek philosopher Plutarch, pushed back, deeming graffiti ridiculous and pointless. But it wasn't until the 5th century that the roots of the modern concept of vandalism were planted. At that time, a barbaric tribe known as the Vandals swept through Rome, pillaging and destroying the city. But it wasn't until centuries later that the term vandalism was actually coined, in an outcry against the defacing of art during the French Revolution. And as graffiti became increasingly associated with deliberate rebellion and provocativeness, it took on its vandalist label. That's part of the reason why today, many graffiti artists stay underground. Some assume alternate identities to avoid retribution, while others do so to establish camaraderie and make claim to territory. Beginning with the tags of the 1960s, a novel overlap of celebrity and anonymity hit the streets of New York City and Philadelphia. Taggers used coded labels to trace their movements around cities while often alluding to their origins. And the very illegality of graffiti making that forced it into the shadows also added to its intrigue and growing base of followers. The question of space and ownership is central to graffiti's history. Its contemporary evolution has gone hand in hand with counterculture scenes. While these movements raised their anti-establishment voices, graffiti artists likewise challenged established boundaries of public property. They reclaimed subway cars, billboards, and even once went so far as to paint an elephant in the city zoo. Political movements, too, have used wall writing to visually spread their messages. During World War II, both the Nazi Party and resistance groups covered walls with propaganda. And the Berlin Wall's one-sided graffiti can be seen as a striking symbol of repression versus relatively unrestricted public access. As the counterculture movements associated with graffiti become mainstream, does graffiti too become accepted? Since the creation of so-called graffiti unions in the 1970s and the admission of select graffiti artists into art galleries a decade later, graffiti has straddled the line between being outside and inside the mainstream. And the appropriation of graffiti styles by marketers and typographers has made this definition even more unclear. The once unlikely partnerships of graffiti artists with traditional museums and brands have brought these artists out of the underground and into the spotlight. Although graffiti is linked to destruction, it's also a medium of unrestricted artistic expression. Today, the debate about the boundary between defacing and beautifying continues. Meanwhile, graffiti artists challenge common consensus about the value of art and the degree to which any space can be owned. Whether spraying, scrawling, or scratching, graffiti brings these questions of ownership, art, and acceptability to the surface.
So now that we understood a little bit more about the history of graffiti, let's talk about graffiti's relation to hip-hop. So starting into the 1980s now, media, which are our television, radios, and TV and movies, they began to link graffiti with other emerging urban cultures, including those of breakdance and rap music. So they began to connect graffiti with the hip-hop culture, which just started out in New York City by the youths of the most neglected areas of the city. So, graffiti has often been used in album covers for rap artists, and additionally, you can find it in many urban areas, on the sides of buildings, on buses, and you can also find it on clothing and other various places. So, starting in the 80s is when they really connected graffiti and hip-hop together, although graffiti has always been around for many, many years. So it's interesting to see that nowadays when we think of graffiti, we also think of hip-hop culture because of how much media has portrayed the both of them together. So now let's talk about different artists. One of the most legendary New York graffiti artists was Zephyr, and he was one of the most important people during the 1970s when he jump-started the Freight Train graffiti movement, where he would tag his name on the side of train cars. And he also invented numerous graffiti styles that are often still used today. The next artist I wanted to point out to everyone is Phase 2. And his real name is Lonnie Wood, but he's better known as Phase 2, just like Zephyr has a nickname. And he is one of the most influential New York graffiti artists, and he is often credited as the inventor of bubble letter graffiti. So you see an example of his bubble letters right here behind a photo of him, where it's really round with all of the stylization in these letters. He also began writing graffiti in the 70s by tagging his name across the city, just like Zephyr did. The next person I wanted to point out is a female artist, and her name is Lady Pink. Her real name is Sandra Fabera, and she was actually born in Ecuador. And she was known as one of the greatest female street artists in Queens, New York, especially considering that a lot of the graffiti artists back in the day, back in the 70s and 80s, many of them were men. So it was really cool to see a woman who was going out there and also tagging around the city with her graffiti artworks. Now let's bring it back on home to Houston. So we in Houston have our own famous graffiti artist, and he is known as Gonzo247. And his real name is Mario E. Figueroa Jr., and he, of course, is better known as Gonzo247. And he was born and raised here in Houston, and he started out doing traditional graffiti art, which he used spray paint and created letters and words on a wall. And nowadays, you can see him creating artworks everywhere in the city of Houston. Here are two of his most popular Houston murals, where he painted along this huge wall, and he wrote here City of Houston, and he wrote some other inspiring words and created a lot of really vibrant, bright designs around it. He also created this piece of Houston where he used a lot of bold text and vibrant, bright colors to highlight the awesomeness of Houston. So now that we've seen a little bit about each of these famous art from these graffiti artists, we're going to go ahead and create our own graffiti artwork using our names. So we're going to create a graffiti name tag, and you see here two examples that I created. The first one being my name, where I used more rectangular and more sharp angles to create the text of my name. And then I also used the bubble letter technique that Phase 2 created to create these bubble letters of my mom's name. So let's go ahead and I'm going to show you in a video how I created my artwork. Okay, so before we get started, go ahead and gather your art supplies. The main things we will need is a piece of paper and something to draw with. I used a pencil, and make sure if you have a pencil, you have an eraser. And the next thing I grabbed was a Sharpie, or you can also grab a pen or a marker if you don't have a Sharpie. The last thing you would have to gather is something to color with. So go ahead and grab crayons, markers, color pencils, whatever you have at home if you want to color your name. I'm going to show you now on my sheet of paper how I created my name. So the first thing I did was grab a pencil and sketch out my name using simple lines like I'm just writing it out. After I write my name out, I'm going to go around each of those lines and create a box shape around it. So I'm going to make these boxy letters. I'm going to go around each of the lines and add these thicker pieces of rectangles around them, and that creates our box shapes for our letters. For some of our letters, I did extend even further down, and some of them I remained pretty short for the lines. So you can see really well with this Y shape that I extended this line out pretty long, and I also curved it out a little bit to stylize the lettering. You can see how I stylized the E as well when I elongated the bottom part of this letter E. So you're going to stylize your letters however you like. Here are just examples of how I did these boxy letters. And I'm sketching it out, and you can keep sketching it out and erase it and draw it over again since we are just using pencil for this first part. After you're done with this, for our next section, I'm going to grab my marker and I'm going to outline each of my letters with the black marker. Make sure you're only outlining the outside edge of that pencil line. You don't want to outline every single little pencil line that you have there, only the outside edge, so you're tracing over and making a nice bold line for your letters. I'm using a black Sharpie again, but if you don't have a black Sharpie, make sure you grab some other material that's darker than your pencil. Or if you really don't have anything at home like another marker or a pen, you could trace out each of your lines with your pencil, but make sure you just push down harder so you have a darker outline. Alright, so for the next part, after I outline each of the letters, I'm going to go around all of my letters. So I'm going to go over my whole name now, and I'm going to wrap it around with an outline on the outside, and I'm going to do it all the way through and create that shape. After that, to make a little 3D effect at the bottom of that shape that I just outlined, I'm going to put a bottom section, and then I'm going to fill it in with some stripes so it looks like it's at the bottom and it's shaded in. After that, I went into each of my letters and I added little dashes or little curved lines to accentuate some of the curves and lines inside. This is optional if you want to add this. This just adds a little bit more extra detail. After that, I went in with an eraser and erased all of those really light pencil lines that you kind of see inside of the letters. That way it's nice and clean and you don't see any of those pencil marks. Finally, at the end, if you want to, I'm grabbing a crayon and I'm coloring in each of my letters. I'm just going to fill in half of my letters with one color, and then later on you will see I color the other half with a different color. So I covered the bottom half with the red, and now I'm going in on the top half with this blue color. Alright, so now that you see me do my name with these boxy letters, I'm going to show you real quick how to do those those bubbly letters like Phase 2 created in his graffiti artwork. Okay, so here I sketched out my mom's name, and I started with the M, and then when I drew the next letter, I made sure it was big enough, but also really clear lines. And I spaced them kind of close together because we want our bubble letters to be touching. Because a lot of the graffiti art that we saw, a lot of the letters actually overlap or touch on the edges. Now I wrote down that name. I'm going to go around each of the lines and put a long oval shape on top of the lines. And that's going to make the bubble shape of each of my letters. I'm just going to go in and keep sketching it out. It's okay if you have a lot of little lines, because again, we're just sketching with the pencil first. Now I'm going with the next letter and adding more bubble shapes along each of those lines. Next, I'm with the letter R, and along each of those lines, I also added a little bubble shape. It kind of looks like little sausages too. And now with my last letter, I added another curved shape. Make sure you have all these curved lines going around, and that's the last letter. After that, I went in with my black marker again, just filling in the outside edge, so I'm outlining each of my letters in with this bold black line. And again, if you don't have a Sharpie or marker, you could use a pen or use a darker shade of your pencil. Alright, let me go back a little bit. So now I'm going in with a pencil just to outline around my name here. And now I'm going in with a pencil again to put more accents in. So if you want to design it out a little bit more, I added another shape with these puffy lines, like a cloud shape, going around the whole name again, just to add a little more detail. Now that I'm finished with that, I'm going to go in and outline all of those lines that I did with the pencil with the black Sharpies, so it's nice and bold. After that, I went under each of my letters and add a little bit of shading with the black. That way my letters pop out a little bit more. So you can see I'm doing that underneath, so wherever there's a part near the bottom of the letter, I'm going to fill it in with a little bit of more black. So I'm using a more bold line. I'm also doing it a little bit on the edges on the right side of my letters. So find wherever you have the right side showing on your letters, you're going to fill that edge in with a darker, more bold line. Just like I'm here. After that, I went into each letter again and I added a little curved accents, little curved lines, and little specks to highlight some of the curves that I have in these bubble letters. And finally, I added little circles going around my outside. So I added little decorations. Now you can add more decorations if you want, or if you want to use other types of designs, you can do it. I do encourage you to be more creative. Think outside the box a little bit. If you see any other kind of graffiti art style that you like, you could try to copy it and make your own name out of it. So go ahead and complete your artwork, and once you are done, I'm going to ask you to please turn it in. So I'm going to show you real quick how you can turn it in. Again, make sure you find my website where you will see the turn in page. So before you do all that, make sure you take a photo or take a video of you and your artwork and have it saved on your device, whether that be your phone or your computer. After that, go ahead and access my website on that turn in assignments page, and on it fill out the Google form and make sure you upload a photo or a video of your artwork so I see what you've done. And after that, make sure you do click that red submit button, otherwise I won't see it. Alright, happy art making, and I can't wait to see all of your awesome graffiti name tags.